never imagined I'd end up in a battle with my HOA president. But life has a strange sense of humor sometimes. My name is Alex Mitchell. 6 months ago, I moved into Sycamore Estates, a quiet suburban neighborhood with pristine lawns, white picket fences, and, as I would soon find out, a homeowners association president who ruled with an iron fist. Her name was Karen Wilkins. Around here, just hearing Karen was enough to make longtime residents roll their eyes and mutter under their breath. For 5 years, Karen had reigned as HOA president, uncontested. Not because she was beloved, but because no one else dared challenge her. She treated the position less like a community service and more like her personal kingdom. Driving around in her spotless white SUV, ruler in hand, she measured grass height, peered over fences, and issued violations for the tiniest infractions. Leave your garbage cans visible an hour too long? Expect a citation. Park your car an inch off the driveway. Another citation. At first, I managed to fly under Karen's radar. 3 quiet months passed, and I thought maybe the horror stories were exaggerated. Then came the accident. A rock climbing trip gone wrong shattered my femur, landing me in a wheelchair for at least 6 months. After 2 weeks in the hospital, I returned home, facing a brutal reality. My house had 3 steps leading up to the front door. I couldn't even enter without help. Determined to regain some independence, my brother and I spent a weekend building a simple, sturdy wooden ramp. It wasn't fancy, but it was safe, secure, and, most importantly, temporary. We designed it so it could be removed once I healed. For the first time since the accident, I felt a spark of freedom, wheeling myself through my own front door without relying on anyone. That freedom lasted exactly 2 days. I found the notice taped to my door, screaming in bright orange letters, "Unapproved structural modification. Remove within 48 hours or face $100 daily fines." It was signed in elegant, swirling cursive, Karen Wilkins, HOA president. I stared at the paper, disbelief turning quickly into anger. I'd barely started my recovery, and here she was, wielding her authority like a weapon. I called the number listed immediately. Karen answered on the second ring, her voice cold and businesslike. "Sycamore Estates HOA office, Karen speaking." "Hi, Karen. This is Alex Mitchell, 427 Burwood Lane. I just received a violation notice about my wheelchair ramp. I was hoping we could talk about it." There was a pause, a sigh heavy with manufactured patience. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, voice tight with condescension, "all structural modifications require prior board approval with proper documentation, submitted at least 30 days in advance. It's outlined clearly in Section 12, Paragraph 4 of the covenant you signed." I clenched my jaw. I understand the rules, but this was an emergency.
"I'm temporarily disabled."
Surely there's an exception for cases like mine. "Rules don't have exceptions, Mr. Mitchell," she snapped. "That would defeat the purpose of having them. Your ramp disrupts the aesthetic uniformity of the neighborhood and must be removed." "But I physically cannot enter my house without it," I said, trying to stay calm. "The Americans with Disabilities Act protects reasonable accommodations. The ADA applies to public spaces and businesses, Mr. Mitchell," she interrupted in a tone usually reserved for explaining crayons to toddlers. "Our HOA is private. Our covenant supersedes such considerations. The ramp must come down." Before I could respond, she added, "If you intend to live in Sycamore Estates, I suggest you familiarize yourself with our bylaws rather than citing irrelevant federal regulations. Have a nice day." And with that, she hung up. I sat there, staring at my phone, heart hammering in my chest. Something inside me snapped. Karen Wilkins had no idea who she was messing with. That night, I sat at my desk, my wheelchair angled awkwardly because of the narrow space. The anger burning inside me pushed away the pain in my leg. I wasn't just going to sit here and let Karen steamroll me. Before I became a law professor, I spent 15 years as a corporate compliance attorney. I knew how rules worked, and I knew how they could be challenged. Karen thought quoting the HOA covenant made her invincible. She was about to learn otherwise. I spent hours reviewing the HOA bylaws, dissecting every section she had so smugly referenced. Then I pulled up the Americans with Disabilities Act, the real one. The more I read, the angrier I got. Karen was right about one thing. HOAs are private entities. But what she ignored, willfully or through sheer arrogance, was that private communities cannot enforce rules that discriminate against people with disabilities. The law was clear. Reasonable accommodations, like temporary wheelchair ramps, were protected. By sunrise, I had drafted a formal letter addressed to the HOA board, not just Karen. I outlined her violations point by point, cited legal precedents, and warned of the consequences for noncompliance, including federal fines and civil rights lawsuits. I attached copies of my medical records, proof of temporary disability, and photos of the ramp showing it was safe and removable. I sent it certified mail to every board member and emailed copies for good measure. Then I waited. 3 days passed. Finally, an email from Karen popped up in my inbox. It was short, smug, and infuriating. Mr. Mitchell, your request for exemption has been noted but must follow proper channels. The ramp remains unauthorized. Fines will begin tomorrow as scheduled. Karen Wilkins, HOA President. That same afternoon, her white SUV was parked across the street. I watched from my living room window as she stepped out, phone in hand, snapping pictures of my ramp like some overzealous parking enforcer. When our eyes met, she gave a tiny, triumphant wave before driving off. Later, my security camera caught her again, taping another orange violation notice to my door.
Fines que menst. $100.
Additional $100 daily until removal. The message was clear. Karen wasn't backing down. Neither was I. The next morning, I made 3 calls. First, to the Department of Justice's ADA Compliance Division. Second, to the State Housing Authority. Third, to an old colleague, James Weaver, a bulldog of a lawyer who specialized in disability discrimination cases. James didn't even hesitate. "I'm in," he said.
Pro bono.
"Let's teach them a lesson." Within 48 hours, James had sent the HOA a formal cease and desist letter, demanding immediate suspension of the fines, restoration of access, and warning of federal investigation if they continued their harassment. The State Housing Authority opened a file on Sycamore Estates. The DOJ added my case to their growing list of HOA accessibility violations. I thought that might finally make Karen back off. Instead, she escalated. The following Sunday, I woke to the unmistakable sound of power tools buzzing outside my house. Groggy and still stiff with pain, I wheeled myself to the window, and my blood ran cold. 2 men, both wearing neon vests, were dismantling my ramp, right there in broad daylight. And standing over them, arms crossed and binder clutched tightly to her chest, was Karen Wilkins, supervising the operation like a general at war. I didn't even think. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher asked. There are people dismantling my wheelchair ramp without my permission, I said, wheeling furiously toward the front door. I'm disabled, and this is my only access to my home. They're trespassing and destroying my property. By the time the police arrived, half of the ramp was already gone. Karen stood proudly at the bottom of my porch steps, her binder of HOA documents pressed to her chest like a shield. This homeowner is in violation of our covenant, she declared to the officer, her voice high and clipped. As HOA president, I'm authorized to remedy violations after providing notice. The officer, an older woman with a no-nonsense demeanor and mirrored sunglasses, turned to me. Is that true, sir? I took a breath, keeping my voice steady. No, ma'am. I'm temporarily disabled and installed this ramp as a reasonable accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act. I filed the necessary legal challenges. This ramp is protected. They're removing my only safe way in and out of my house. I handed her the thick stack of documentation. My lawyer's cease and desist letter, the acknowledgement from the DOJ, my medical proof. The officer reviewed it carefully, flipping through the pages, her expression growing increasingly stern. Finally, she turned back to Karen. Ma'am, you need to tell these men to stop immediately, the officer said firmly. What you're doing potentially violates several laws, including destruction of property and civil rights violations under the ADA. Karen's jaw tightened until her face turned a deep shade of red. Officer, with all due respect, she said, voice dripping with contempt. You don't understand HOA law. Our covenant clearly states. The officer cut her off, voice sharp as a whip. Ma'am, HOA covenants do not override federal law. I strongly suggest you cease this activity immediately or I will have no choice but to take further action. There was a moment of silence. The workers glanced nervously at each other, dropping their tools and backing away from the ramp. Karen glared at me with such pure hatred that for a moment, I half expected her to physically lunge at me. Instead, she spun around to the workers. Stop. For now, she barked. We'll resolve this through the proper channels. As she stormed off toward her SUV, the officer turned back to me. Sir, I recommend you document the damage thoroughly and contact your attorney immediately. Would you like to press charges for the property destruction? I looked past her at Karen's white SUV peeling away down the street. Oh, absolutely, I said, my voice low and steady. I believe I would. Over the next few weeks, my life became a whirlwind of legal filings, insurance claims, and frustrating phone calls. Karen, unwilling to admit defeat, convinced the HOA board to allocate funds for legal representation. Their first attorney, after reviewing the facts, strongly advised them to settle. Karen promptly fired him. She hired another, someone more aggressive, someone who promised to stand firm against the so-called erosion of community standards. He lasted 2 weeks before quitting too, citing unresolvable legal exposure. The HOA board, once quietly supportive of Karen, was beginning to fracture. Whispers floated around the neighborhood. People were angry, not just at the mess Karen had created, but at the embarrassment now dragging Sycamore Estates into the public eye. Because while Karen played dictator, the local news caught wind of the story. One evening, while I was sipping coffee and grading papers, I saw it, a teaser running across the bottom of the TV screen. Local HOA president faces federal investigation for disability discrimination. They hadn't even interviewed me yet, but the story was out, and it was spreading. Karen's empire was starting to crack, and I was just getting started. The morning after the news segment aired, my phone rang. It was Michael, the HOA vice president. His voice sounded strained, like he'd aged 10 years overnight. We've called an emergency board meeting for tonight, he said. For what it's worth, most of us never wanted this fight, Alex. Karen, well, she's very passionate about the rules. I understand, I replied calmly. I'm not looking to burn the place down. I just want access to my own home. That evening, I navigated my wheelchair through the packed community center. Neighbors I'd never met before held open doors, offered smiles. Some even patted my shoulder in quiet solidarity. At the front of the room, the board members sat behind a long table. Karen occupied the center seat, rigid as a statue, her face unreadable but her knuckles white as she clutched her binder. She called the meeting to order with a tight-lipped announcement. We are here to discuss the situation regarding Mr. Mitchell's violation. I caught the way she refused to say ramp or even acknowledge my disability. Typical. Before she could continue, Michael cleared his throat. Actually, Karen, the board has already voted. As per our emergency procedures, we conducted an email vote earlier today. Karen's head snapped around to glare at him. We have decided, Michael continued steadily, to rescind all fines issued to Mr. Mitchell, to approve his temporary ramp, and to issue a formal apology on behalf of the HOA. Karen's face went from pink to crimson in seconds. You can't make that decision without my approval, she hissed, rising from her seat so quickly her chair scraped loudly against the tile. Another board member, an older woman with a calm voice, spoke up. We can, and we have. Furthermore, we voted to settle the legal complaint immediately and to use HOA insurance to cover any damages caused to Mr. Mitchell's property. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. This is outrageous, she cried. You're letting him destroy our property values over an ugly wooden plank." The room fell silent. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably. A few shook their heads. Michael stood, adjusting his glasses. "There's one more matter," he said. "In light of recent events, the potential financial liability, and the serious reputational damage to Sycamore Estates, we've also voted on a second item." Karen froze. "We voted to remove you, Karen, from the position of HOA president immediately under the misconduct provision in our bylaws." For a moment, it was like the world itself paused. Karen stared at the board members, at the neighbors filling the room, at me. "No," she said, voice trembling. "You can't do this. I've given 5 years to this community. I've upheld the standards. I've protected our property values." The sadness in her voice almost sounded genuine, for half a second. "The vote was unanimous," Michael said quietly. "And furthermore," he added, his voice hardening, "we've been notified that the district attorney's office is investigating your actions. Destruction of property. Civil rights violations under the Americans with Disabilities Act." Karen's mouth fell open. "You've brought this on yourself, Karen," one of the other board members said, not unkindly. "You went too far." Karen gathered her papers with trembling hands, her facade finally cracking. "This isn't over," she spat, her voice thick with rage and desperation. "You have no idea what you've just done." She shoved past the board table and stormed toward the exit, only to be forced to awkwardly maneuver around my wheelchair. For a brief moment, our eyes locked. In that instant, I saw it, the realization sinking in. The fear of real consequences replacing the smug superiority that had ruled her face for so long. She knew. She had lost. And this time, no binder of rules was going to save her. The next morning, the final blow landed. Karen Wilkins was formally served at her immaculate 2-story home, right there on her front porch, by a uniformed process server. I watched discreetly from my window as it unfolded. She opened the door in her usual crisp slacks and pastel sweater, clipboard still clutched in hand like a lifeline. The process server spoke briefly, handed her a thick stack of documents, and walked away without waiting for a response. Karen just stood there, clutching the papers, frozen like a statue. Later, I learned what was in the documents. Charges of destruction of private property. Violation of civil rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Abuse of authority in a private entity. The penalties she faced? Up to 1 year in jail and fines exceeding $50,000. The moment the server disappeared down the sidewalk, Karen's carefully composed mask cracked completely. "But I was just following the rules," she whispered to no one, her voice breaking, barely audible over the chirp of suburban birds and the hum of a distant lawnmower. For the first time since I'd moved to Sycamore Estates, the street felt different. It wasn't Karen's kingdom anymore. Neighbors began to emerge from their homes, some watching discreetly from behind curtains, others openly standing in driveways. Whispers floated on the breeze, but no one approached her. No one offered comfort. No one offered defense. Karen was alone. Word spread quickly after that. The HOA board issued a formal apology not just to me, but to the entire neighborhood for allowing things to escalate so badly. They revised their bylaws to add a clear emergency accommodation policy, ensuring no one else would face what I had. My ramp remained exactly where it was until I no longer needed it. And when the day came that I was finally strong enough to walk up my front steps again without it, I removed it myself, quietly, without ceremony. Karen eventually moved out. The house she had guarded so fiercely went on the market, its lawn overgrown and its porch empty. Fewer and fewer people even mentioned her name after that. It was as if she had been a bad storm that passed through, leaving behind a shaken but stronger community. As for me, the experience left scars, emotional and otherwise, but it also reminded me of something important. Sometimes standing your ground isn't about shouting the loudest or throwing the biggest punches. Sometimes it's about knowing when the law and common decency are on your side, and about refusing to be bullied, even by someone who thinks they're untouchable. Especially then. In a way, Karen did teach me something after all. Not about rules, but about resilience. And for that, oddly enough, I'm grateful.